is Anthony from mycodeteacher.com. In this lesson, I'm going to show you a really cool tip for how to ensure backwards compatibility in your iPhone apps. So let's say, for example, a new API comes out for iOS 5, but you want to build your app for iOS 4 so that iOS 4 users who haven't upgraded can still install your app and run it, but you also want the new API included for people who have upgraded. And you want this to run without any crashes on both operating systems and without any warnings when you try to compile or errors. So there's three areas in which we need to make sure that this all works. The first is for creating an instance of this object that exists within the newer API. So for basically most cases when you do this, and I'm not sure if this may not work in all cases with all new APIs, but for most it's as simple as there's a new class and you just need to use it. So for that situation, and again that'll be most, you need to be able to create an instance of this new class without compiler warnings, or actually compiler errors. The second area is instance variables. So creating an instance variable of this type in your own custom class. And then the third is delegate methods. So for example, this new API, this new class sends delegate methods to your object. You need to be able to, first of all, you have to be able to have the delegate method in your code without it throwing warnings because it's never seen the sender type, which is going to be that new object. And also you need to be able to use the object without any crashes. So personally, I ran into this problem a while ago when I was trying to use the UI local notification object, the new local notification API that Apple introduced in iOS 4. I wanted to build the app that I was working on for iOS 3, 3.1.2 I think specifically it was, using Xcode 3.2. So now the problem with that is Xcode 3.2, because it was older, had never heard of UI local notification. And I needed a way to be able to build the app with no warnings and also have it run on iOS 3 devices as well as iOS 4 devices. And so I figured out a great way to do that. So I've got Xcode open, and of course we'll start by creating a new project. I'm going to call this backwards. And so let's start with an example. Let's say you had this class called SomeClass, and you needed it to be an instance variable, but you weren't going to import the .h file until you were in the M file. So here you're going to import SomeClass.h. So the problem is it's not been imported in the .h file, the backwards app delegate.h file, and so the compiler is going to throw an error. So I'm going to get rid of this because it doesn't exist, and I'm going to try to build and run. And you can see we have an error, and that's this error here. So now there's a great keyword in Objective-C called @class. And basically what it does is it tells the compiler not to worry, that this class does in fact exist and you can trust the developer. And so now once I implement that, it runs or launches just fine. So we're going to do exactly this for UI local notification. So we'll start just to show you. Now I'm using the newer version of Xcode, so local notification doesn't in fact exist, but this will also work on an old version. Okay, so that is for instance variables. So let's go to our checklist and check off instance variables. Now I showed you the second thing on the list as opposed to the first one first because it's a bit simpler. So the next area, it's not difficult per se, but it is a bit harder. There's a function in Cocoa called ns class from string. It's a fantastic function because it allows us to do exactly what we're trying to do. You input a string and it returns that class. So if that class doesn't exist, it simply returns nil, and that's exactly how we can use it. So class local notification class equals ns class from string UI local notification. So if you are building this for iOS 3.0 and someone with the iOS 3.0 is trying to run this, even though this class doesn't exist, it'll build and run just fine, because what happens is this function checks to see if this class exists. If it does, it returns a link to that class, so you can create an object of that class's type. If it doesn't, it simply returns nil. So as you can imagine, now we can just check. If it's not nil, then we create a notification. Again, we have to be generic in how we create objects, because we don't want the compiler to throw warnings and errors. Now again, because of the fact that we use this @class token, we actually don't have to be generic, but I'm gonna, just for good practice, and here we're gonna create a notification object. And so now, if this is on iOS 3, everything inside this if statement never gets run. If it's not on iOS 3, if we're on iOS 4 or above, everything in this if statement will be executed, and here we will have a notification object stored in notification 2. Now we can use it as we want. We can set a fire date. We can set if it repeats, etc. So now there's the second thing, or I guess this would be the third thing we need to look at. Now we'll bump down the delegate methods to the fourth thing. The third thing we need to look at is that another problem is that because we're using this dot syntax for properties, the compiler is going to throw an error, because even though you're telling it not to worry and that the UI local notification does exist, it still doesn't have the .h file for it, so it doesn't know what it has. It doesn't know what properties it has, what instance variables it has, what methods it has. So it's going to throw an error saying that this property does not exist for this class. Now, let's take a step back and look at the history of Cocoa and key value coding. So the reason that this works is because a while ago Apple developers introduced something called key value coding. And what that does is you give a class a key or an instance variable, and you refer to it via a key, a specific key for only that instance variable, and then you have two methods: a method to set the instance variable based on the key, and a method to retrieve the instance variable's value based on the key. So if we take a look at UI local notification, we have a key fire date, and what that means is there are set fire date, and the fire date instance variable from within the notification class is set. And then we have a retrieval method, or a getter method. Again, this is pretending as if we were in the notification, the UI local notification.m file, implementing its methods. And so now, because we've done this, we have created essentially a key, a fire date key, linked to the fire date instance variable. And so what that means is we can use two functions: value for key and set value for key. Two functions that come with any subclass of NS object. So essentially any object you'll be working with when you develop iPhone apps will respond to those two. And so the great thing about that is it also avoids crashes and errors and warnings, because if the key does exist, it returns the value for the key. If the key doesn't exist, it simply returns nil. And if you try to set a key that doesn't exist, it just doesn't work. And if it does exist, it sets it. So to avoid compiler errors here, instead of using the dot syntax, we're actually going to use notification 2 set value for key fire date. We can use this for all the values. And so that is a great tool for avoiding compiler errors for objects it's never heard of or doesn't have the .h file for. And so the final thing we want to look at is how to ensure backwards compatibility for delegate methods of these new APIs. So let's open up Safari and take a look at UI local notification guide or reference, and let's take a look at the application did receive local notification delegate method. So when your application, when you set a local notification and you set it for a fire date, it gets triggered, it sends this, or it calls to this method, sends it to your application instance. And so as a part of the UI application delegate, we can put that in our backwards app-delegate.m file. And so again, because we put that at class keyword, the compiler it's not going to throw errors. It's going to assume that this does exist. And so just for good practice, and in fact, if this was iOS 3, this method would never be called, but just for good practice, we're going to repeat what we did up here and just check to see that the class exists. And on the inside, if you say you wanted to get the user info, where the user info stores some information that you want to pass back to your application when the notification is triggered, you can see that, well, if we go back a second, you can see that everything here has property next to it, and that means that it conforms to key value coding. And so user info is a key that references the user info instance variable of a notification object. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. So if this were on an iOS 4 device, you have everything you need, and you can use this class, you could use this user info object, anything else, any other variables. And if it's not, none of this will get run. And it's as simple as that. So that concludes this tutorial. I hope this helped you with backwards compatibility. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. I'm Anthony from MyCodeTeacher.com. Thanks for watching.